Thank you, Levi, and thank you, Annette, for putting this together. I'm excited to talk about, what I've been up to in my life for the last 4 months. And so I hope you don't get bored. And it's something exciting as well to you, as it has been to me. So in 2011, I obeyed a strange instinct. I was weeks away from writing my bar exams. And while sitting in the large auditorium where lectures were held, I logged onto Facebook, as you do when you're reading, as a very unserious student. And Emeka Okereke, who is the director of Invisible Borders, had just put up a link to the new website announcing the 3rd edition of the road trip. I wrote Emeka immediately saying I was a big fan of the road trip and I had followed their journey since 2009. And although I knew the participant had been selected, was there any way I could participate? He wrote back in less than an hour and said, did I have a sample of my work I could show him? Could I share my bio? And in less than a day, I was confirmed as a participant of the 2011 road trip from Lagos to Addis Ababa. That email to Emeka saved me from what might have been a woeful legal practice and made me realize that I wanted to write about art and the communities built around contemporary African art. So, just show some images. This is the first group of participants of the road trip, and I'll talk about them in a bit. And this is the group that traveled in 2011. You can kind of see me here. I was probably shorter and better looking. And so these are just some images of myself. This is the border between Nigeria and Cameroon. And this is when we are trying to change money. So I'll just leave that here. I began my involvement with Invisible Borders as a participant in 2011, but my role has evolved in the last 3 years and I guess will keep evolving. I have remained attracted to the project's code of manners, if I can borrow words from Guy Davenport, which is travel across physical and mental borders. In the process of traveling, I realized that by writing about my encounters, I could begin to cross those borders. Invisible Borders was founded in 2009 when a group of 10 Nigerian photographers led by Emeka Okereke opted to travel by road from Lagos to Bamako for the annual festival of photography held in the city. Some of the photographers, Emeka, Uche James Iroha, Uche Okbairoha, Amazie Ojekere, we are going to Bamako for the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th time. The organizers usually cover their flight expenses. 2 of the 10 photographers had been invited for that year's festival. They asked the organizers for the monetary equivalent of the flight tickets and used that sum to sponsor more participants. When they arrived in Bamako, they were welcomed as kind of heroes. The photographs taken while on the road were presented to the festival's audience. While traveling, they had kept a blog that archived the photographs and diaristic writings by some of the participants. A second trip took place in 2010 along the same route as the first year, but towards Dakar. The old participants were retained in addition to 1 new participant. 1 participant dropped out in the course of the trip somewhere in Burkina Faso, and so it became clear to Emeka and his ally, the late Ray Daniels Okeogo, that what was at stake was bigger than a specific group of participants or a collective. In 2011, before the road trip from Lagos to Addis Ababa, the first I participated in, Invisible Borders was registered as a non-profit in Nigeria, committed to working with artists and individuals to patch, in quotes, the numerous gaps and misconceptions posed by frontiers within the 54 countries of Africa through art and photography, end of quotes, and to serve as a platform that stands as a symbol of exchange of ideas between cultures and people. I want to take off this photo of myself and just go to, okay, good. So with this manifesto in mind, the 2011 road trip was the first where non-Nigerian participants from, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Sudan, were invited to participate. And for the first time also, a writer and a cultural historian were invited to participate. The limits were pushed further in 2012. Artists from Mozambique, Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, and South Africa were invited to participate. The trip began in Lagos and ended in Libreville, Gabon, although our original destination was Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And for reasons of funding and the photography festival that was going to be held in Lubumbashi that year was cancelled. So we decided to stop 2 countries before Congo. So this was my second time on the trip in 2010. And by then I had abandoned every ambition to practice law, pursuing instead impoverishing arts projects. At the end of the trip, I was asked to develop content for and manage the Invisible Borders website. I guess I did that well, which is what happens when you're not paid. And in 2013, I became one of 4 directors. So I'll show some more images. This is images from the 2011 road trip. I don't want to bore you with details of names and all, but should I do that? Do you want to know the names of these people? And this is in Douala in Cameroon. And this is me trying to do an interview. This has become one of the iconic, I guess, circumstances around the 2011 road trip because we traveled through, before we got into Cameroon, it's just like 5 kilometers of roads bordering Cameroon and Nigeria, and you have we met this awful condition, and this road had never been walked on for over 60 years, I guess. And so to humor ourselves, we danced, and we danced again. So the 2014 road trip. Early on in 2013, Emeka Okereke and I began to discuss the possibilities of traveling from Lagos to Europe. Emeka is certainly more ambitious than I am, so he brought it up. Without thinking, I said yes, that's feasible, although I think it was his charisma that persuaded me more than the logic of his arguments. We wanted to chart a different trajectory from the previous editions of the road trip. We're going to travel from Lagos to Sarajevo, from a country in Western Africa through Western Europe and aim to arrive at Eastern Europe. There were a couple of reasons we enumerated, and this is how I interpret them. First, Africa could be mapped in other ways apart from geography. Daily, Africans migrate into Europe, transporting their cultures and subcultures, their identities and sub-identities. The second reason was the question, how do maps shift? And the third, what is the everyday space? When we say we are interested in everyday Africa, which is something we kept saying, what does this mean? And fourthly, how could we assemble artists with different sensibilities and allow them to use the trip as a platform for developing their ideas and sharpening their perceptions about life on the continent? Also, to see if, by traveling for a long period of time, we could come to terms with the nature of Trans-African mobility. And one of the stories that we realized was grossly undertold was that of intercontinental migrants. That's people who move from one country in Africa to the other. And we wanted to figure out what that meant. And lastly, as always, we wanted to promote an ideal that people on the continent wouldn't be held back by borders initiated during the period of colonialism. So in August 2013, we circulated a call for applications. At the close of the application process in November, we received close to 70 applications from photographers, visual artists, filmmakers, writers, and performance artists. There were applications from South Africa, Egypt, Eritrea, Nigeria, Botswana, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, and applications from South Africa, and Nigeria, and Egypt were dominated the list. So 7 artists in all were selected, in addition to Emeka and I, bringing the number to 9. And so these participants included Dawit El Petros, who is a visual artist from Eritrea and who grew up in Canada and lives in New York. Heba Amin, an Egyptian artist based in Berlin. Inokutle Nkosi, a writer from South Africa based in Cape Town. Breeze Yoko, a graffiti artist and filmmaker from South Africa based in Johannesburg. Renee Mboya, a writer from Kenya based in Nairobi. Tom Seta, a photojournalist from Nigeria based in Abuja, Nigeria. Angus McNeon, a photographer from South Africa based in Cape Town. Emeka Okereke, a photographer and filmmaker from Nigeria based in Amsterdam and Lagos. And for the first time this year, we hired a full-time driver so that we could just focus on, traveling and making work. The trip began on June 2nd, and as I speak, is 2 weeks from being completed. I return for the final week of the journey tomorrow, and I have this long flights, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I arrive in Moscow to transit to. It's a complicated thing. Anyway, so we would have been on the road for almost 150 days, and which is 5 months. It's actually a long time. So how did we travel? We didn't stop in some of the cities we planned to stop. In some cases, we had stayed too long in the last city and had to travel on to meet up with deadlines, while in other cases, our local collaborators advised against spending time in places that weren't exciting enough. So a summary of the places we stopped in until my departure on August 29. So and I'll just run through this itinerary. Non-Nigerian participants arrived in Lagos, and then it was kind of a haphazard trip. The Nigerian participants then traveled by road to Abuja, the capital city, which is 10 hours away, to apply for a Moroccan visa, which is a story I'll get to. Then we returned to Lagos. And when we returned to Lagos, we started traveling. We traveled to Accra, Ghana, stopping in Lomé, Togo, and traveling through Benin Republic. And then we stopped from Accra, we got to Abidjan, Ivory Coast. From Abidjan, we traveled to a small town called Fekesedougou, which was very central to the last civil war that broke out in Ivory Coast. And one interesting story about that place is, we played a football match with some people who live there. I don't want to say local, it's a strange word. But, and so the police were really scared that who are these guys that just arrived with all of this equipment and this long van playing football. And, we had to explain ourselves. Anyway, so from Fekesedougou, we moved to Ivory Coast, Yamoussoukro in Ivory Coast, which is the capital city. And one fun fact about Yamoussoukro is that it houses the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace, which is modeled after the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, but bigger. And people say it's the largest church in the world. It was built with $300 million. From Yamoussoukro, we traveled to Bamako in Mali, from Bamako to Dakar in Senegal. From Senegal, we traveled through Touba and came back to Dakar, and then traveled to St. Louis in Senegal. It's called St. Louis. It's called in a strange French way. I don't know how to say it well. From there, we traveled to Mauritania, stopping in Nouakchott and in Nouadhibou. And then we went back to Dakar, and this was during the period when we were really trying to get a visa to Morocco. And because only 4 people out of 10 had these visas, we figured it was pointless to divide the group in that way, sending 4 people to travel to Morocco. So we went back to Dakar and flew from Dakar to Madrid. And so we made our way back because Madrid is more or less in the center of central Spain, and we went back to Malaga, which is closer to the south of Spain. And in Malaga, some of my colleagues who had visas to Morocco then took the ferry and traveled to Morocco, you know, stopping in the nearest city to the Spanish border, which is Marrakesh in Morocco, and spending about a week or two there. And so I left at the end of August, and my colleagues went on to travel through Barcelona, Paris, Amsterdam, and now, you know, they're in Berlin, where I'll join them. I should mention that not everyone who started the trip is still on board, but I hope that I can be asked questions about that. But yeah, it's one of the interesting things about traveling together for 5 months, that it's not all fun. So while traveling, our activities included, you know, meeting and making friends with local artists and cultural practitioners who collaborated on events with us or helped us get around. Exploring the cities we stopped at by visiting studios, monuments, and just, you know, taking walks. Meeting together for portfolio reviews and crit sessions where we took turns to present our work to the rest of the group and get constructive, sometimes discouraging feedback. And we also, you know, did a couple of things for recreation. I can't remember what I did in my free time, but yeah. So I guess it's also important for me to show some of the work that has been produced during the course of the road trip, to just give you an idea of what we're doing. And I'll just show photographs because it's harder to, you know, show text or something. So these are some photographs from 2009 to 2012. I mean, the first 3 editions of the road trip. I'll go over this very quickly, but they're all on the website of Invisible Borders. It's a very good one. And yeah, that's me posing for, yeah, it's kind of weird. This is somewhere in Sudan. Somewhere in Cameroon. No. Ethiopia, from 2011. This is in the Cameroon-Chad border. So I'll just let that sit for a while. So how did I participate? Well, as a writer, the great benefit I've had is to come into art criticism through literature, specifically through fiction. In 2011, when Emeka asked for a sample of my writing, I sent him an essay and a short story I had written a month earlier. I have stayed committed to creating no hierarchies between the two forms, and so while on the road, I was free to keep thinking of writing that was clear, imaginative, but also in conversation with art. I reunited with one of the participants of the 2011 road trip in Accra this year, and I remember how shocked she was that I could do the trip 3 times. I don't know how I've managed to do it twice, and I promise this year is my last, but I recognize in retrospect that after my first 2 participations, I didn't feel comfortable with the shape of my thinking about the travels, which means that before 2014, I felt like I didn't have the ability to complement my experiences with critical thinking. So being in New York, I guess, being distant from the roads I'd driven through, and studying a program that emphasizes the development of one's sensibilities as well as one's writing style, readied me for, I believe, an informed engagement while on the road. So for the sake of brevity, I think it's important that I iterate some of the considerations that guided my writing on this year's road trip. First of all, I couldn't afford to be a specialist. That's one of our mantras in this department. Due to the amount of time we were spending in a city, 10 days on the average, there was no way I could write essays that were in any way fact-based. I had to trust my intuition and impulses. And for me, the recurring question was always, what appears relevant to write that morning? Secondly, I was paying attention to the way images were being produced while we were on the road. We kept a blog of sorts and updated our Facebook, page regularly. In other words, there were loads of images. But I wanted to slow things down with my writing, and so I began to write what I called subtext, which were 250 to 400 word essays that reflected on the conditions of production of text and images while we were on the road. Thirdly, I returned constantly to an essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller, where he more or less creates a broad ethical framework for storytelling. And one of the things he writes is, quotes, "An orientation towards practical matters is characteristic of many born storytellers." I felt that with the encounters we were having, I could simply divulge practical interest. Some of the essays I wrote were, in truth, only transcriptions of conversations I had. So I think it's also important to do a shout out to Zephyr, where one of those essays appears. So there's a free journal that we publish every year in the department, and if you can take 5 and give your friends. There's a box. There are boxes of, and I'm in charge of distribution, so I think So while transcribing the conversations, I became aware of some of the gaps in the stories. Actually, what I meant to say was that one of the transcribed conversations appears in Zephyr, so that's why I went off that tangent. Sometimes, simply as a result of the time I spent with these narrators, I became aware of the gaps in the stories they were telling me. And this was where I had to resort to the imagination. And finally, I was committed to exploring the idea of an intimate stranger. I wanted my writing on the road to reflect a willingness to understand the people we encountered. I couldn't know everything. My vulnerability might never equal that of others. And this is something, one of my classmates, Tatiana Schlaro, taught me through her writing on the Here and Elsewhere show for one of our seminars, that our vulnerabilities can never really always equal that of others. But I wanted my writing to embody an attempt at being intimate. And there's a great book which I keep returning to on writing and the writing process by Breton Breitenbach, where he describes a writer as an intimate stranger, amongst other things. So to give you an idea of what I was writing, I hope it's not crap, I would like to read to you a short essay I wrote about a man we met in Bamako, Mali. He is, I guess he still is, he should still be, the chairman of the Nigerian community there, and runs an organization dedicated to fighting women trafficking. And I called it A Man Fighting. For him to remain anonymous, I'll call him by his name, Gabriel. In Bamako, where he lives, he's known by a fake name. He's tall and agile like a gymnast, but unsuspecting as though he wouldn't won before he pounds. Until he speaks, I think he's any kind of man, without mission and without despair, but Gabriel is a man burdened with a lot of cares. Since 2003, he has headed an organization that fights human trafficking. He came here when going to Malta became impossible. Earlier, when he worked in Nigeria, he had the habit of crawling the West Coast using money he had saved. From the outset, I think he had his eyes fixed elsewhere, and this elsewhereness has led him here, where he can at least propose an alternative for women deceived into sexual slavery. This is his 14th year. When he came to Bamako, he didn't think it was habitable. 14 years later, he still plans to return to Nigeria to end his days as a farmer. When we tell him our mission overland from Lagos to Sarajevo along the coast, he says he's happy we aren't traveling through the desert. He tells us how to recognize the burial place of a Nigerian in the desert. You see stones in the desert. You thank God if your truck does not hit the stones, because a lot of accidents on the way are mostly because of these stones, and there's a dead person inside. That is if his friends were kind enough to give him a burial, give him a home. Those days when we saw this, we removed the stones and you see the corpse dried with his documents by his side, and we recognize him as Nigerian. Later, he says, in the desert, death means nothing. His voice is unshaken when he says all of this. If he's broken by these experiences, his brokenness is like water yet to be stirred. He talks about Tuaregs in the desert. If you run into them, God is your only savior. They don't care if you're a woman, if you're a man or a woman, they fuck your ass for you. Yeah, I remember a situation where 22 persons were brought to our camp. They couldn't sit with their ass. They were all bleeding through their ass. He had read Chairman Mao when he was younger in Nigeria, whom he quotes as writing, "It is stupid for a man to argue with a man with a gun." Gabriel's recollection is shadowed by recursive time. It is more than a decade since he attempted crossing the desert to Malta, but the scars remain fresh, even potent, as though in another week he would try to prove himself wrong. Most Nigerians living in Mali, he says, are birds of passage who were attempting to go to Europe through the deserts, except Igbo traders who came for business. These Nigerians live as though within a pulse. Indeed, there is no other word. A pulse is like half strides, like Jacob walking extra 7 years for the love of his life. They take up mid-term identities as they crawl towards a destination. Some, like Gabriel, get as far as Libya. Some die of hydration. After seeing these things, going back to Nigeria was like a disgrace, he says. Girls who are taken across the desert to be initiated into the sex industry in Europe are told it's an easy journey. They are asked to take nothing but backpacks without many clothes, little food, and few liters of water. In exchange for bread and water, Gabriel says they offer their bodies. A trafficker moves with about a dozen girls, sleeping with all of them. And since the sex is unprotected, unwanted pregnancies are aborted with the spoke of a bicycle. Gabriel did not return from the desert with a bridle in his tongue. Sometimes the incidents he recollects are lush with hyperbole, yet stories like this become truer with exaggeration. They deserve to be told according to the storyteller's recurring motions of sadness and regret. A man like Gabriel will reveal a nuance absent from scholastic accounts, forever shaken by what his eyes have seen. In retelling his story and that of those who share his experience, we choose to imbue experience with greater words, to provide explanations for the instincts that make crossing the desert necessary. So I guess it's time to move to some images from the 2014 road trip. So this is our first group portrait in Lagos. And this is not a complete group. I mean, 2 people were yet to arrive from South Africa. So, and this is, should point here. This is Angus, who is a South African photographer. This is me. This is Heba, who is from Egypt and living in Berlin. This is Renee, a writer from Kenya. This is Emeka, who founded the project. This is Dawit L. Petros, a visual artist based here. And this is Tom, a photo journalist from Nigeria. This was our first panel discussion in Accra. And quite an enthusiastic crowd. And this was our selfie with Malik Sidibe. It's kind of weird. Yeah. Just looking at the eyes make me laugh. I mean, the way our eyes appear here. And this was a proper photograph. This is a photo taken while we were held up in a border. Right now it's so hazy that I can't remember where this was. But what interested me about showing this photograph is you can see some of the towns and how much you have to pay to get there. So Kai, which is in Senegal, you pay 4,000 CFA. Just it's kind of interesting. This was a presentation we had in Dakar. this was one of those crit sessions. As you can see, I was very bored. Yeah. And yeah, I was always slouching for some reason. This is one of the meetings we had with a group of artists and galleries in Mauritania. This is actually one of the only, we spent almost 2 weeks in Mauritania, and this was the only gallery there, and nobody hears about this kind of things from Mauritania. The only thing you hear is that slavery is the last stronghold of slavery, as CNN reported. And it had to be CNN, by the way. So this was Mauritania, and then this was after arriving from Madrid. As I said, we had traveled backwards, and from Madrid we traveled down to Malaga, and we're waiting for our host and guide when I was the only one smiling. I don't know why. We were working with the Spanish photographer to produce a photo book, which just reminds me that I've not asked about the fate of that. Anyway, yeah. So these are just, I think I should have made a broader selection, but I just wanted you to have a glimpse of what the conditions were and the kind of experiences we had. This is, one of the graffiti artists who is very, very talented. Last month we had an exhibition open. I think it's the largest exhibition that we've had at the Prince Claus Gallery in Amsterdam. And so, because the group traveled, it was an exhibition of the 5 years of the road trip, but then they had to also do something from the current road trip. So this was part of the work that was put up for the exhibition. Well, this is what's left of the team. It's kind of cool. And I'll be joining them in a couple of hours. Now, I think the final thing I wanted to get to is to talk about some of the reflections, that I began to have while traveling. It's very difficult to unpack my reflections on the road trip in less than an hour's presentation, but let me attempt an elegant cop-out and talk about 2 things. These reflections are based on specific experiences, which I'll point out as well. The first thing is that the borders weren't invisible. And one of the things that we always realized was that invisible borders was also a concept and not necessarily just, an organization or a project. And that every time we said, we more or less like invoked the name, said invisible borders, we're invoking something that was impossible, an ideal that could never be achieved. So I guess it wasn't too surprising that the borders weren't as invisible as we thought they were. So we as I said, we didn't manage to get into Morocco. We flew from Dakar to Madrid and made our way back to Malaga, located in the south of Spain. And from there, a couple of participants with Moroccan visas traveled to Marrakesh, the first major Moroccan town after the Spanish border. Visas were denied the Nigerians and South Africans in the group. We thought this was at first political. The Nigerian and South African governments were vocal in their opposition to Morocco's continued colonization of Western Sahara. And in our application for the visas, the initial application, we made the fatal and perhaps useful mistake of specifying Western Sahara as a country. So the Moroccans took it very personal. And so this infuriated them. And after attempting to get visas first in Nigeria, in Mali, in Senegal, and in Mauritania, almost paying a bribe at a point, we were told that we couldn't get a visa because of the Ebola virus. So many contradictions attend border crossing in Africa. In some cases, it's cheaper to fly to Europe than to other African countries. Fly to Europe than... The difficulty Nigerians and sub-Saharan Africans experience in getting North African visas is likely a function of the flood of immigrants who travel through the desert to reach North Africa and then Europe. So in essence, the border between Europe and Africa is constantly being shifted by the European Union. If they can enforce strict, the logic is if they can enforce strict immigration laws in Morocco, they can control the influx of unlawful immigrants. I mean, the Spanish Civil Guard has a strong presence in Mauritania. So that should say something about how this works. So secondly, the other thing I kept thinking about was, when we arrived in Mauritania, a country of almost 4 million people that is sandwiched between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, I realized that until that point in the trip, I hadn't felt black. I mean, I'll say that. Mauritania is famous for being the last stronghold of slavery, according to a 2012 CNN documentary. One could easily see the class divide, the white Moors and the black Africans. Although, of course, things aren't just black and white, as there's a tribe of black Moors as well. My impulse was to respond with a performative walk along the streets of Nouakchott, wearing the ubiquitous male attire known as the dra. I made friends with Salih, an English-speaking Moor, who, unlike most educated Mauritanians, couldn't speak French. Once in a few years, Salih said, a group of mostly black Africans protested against the country's designation as Francophone. They wanted English to be accepted as a national language as well. So this will give you an idea of how complex that country is. By walking in a dra, and I'll show images in a bit, I hoped to become intimate with the city, to slip into one of the more recognizable bodies. I think this worked in some way. So before I go to concluding and showing some images of, walking in the dra, I'll just also show some of the images that were produced by artists while we were on the road. And this is just, a very meager selection. So this is the taxi driver series that Angus McKinnon, the South African photographer, worked on throughout, his time on the road. And, I don't want to talk about. I think it's cool. And this was in Abidjan. And this is an untitled image by Dawit El Petros, who is a visual artist, and he, made this image in Mauritania. And one of the things he said to me was that he was really fascinated by the fact that the sea and the desert was a very prominent features in Mauritania. And this is an image by Emeka Okereke, and which he called Face Space. And a more interesting one. While we were on the road, Tom Sata, who is a photojournalist, worked on a photo studio project. So he was, especially when we got to Bamako, which, has a lot of photo studios. And this is actually Malik Sidibe's son. And if you can see the image, you see Studio Malik Sidibe, which, meeting him was such a highlight for us on the trip. And this is, pairing the exterior and the interior as one image. And this as well. So to conclude, I would like to, read another excerpt from an essay I wrote on the blog about, the walk. And I think I should just move to the first image so you can have an idea of what it looks like. And so an impulse is often the only ally a stranger has. In a photograph from the early 90s, I am standing with my siblings. My head is hanging downwards as if I'm disturbed by an ineffable sadness. I returned to this photograph by accident, reading through a WhatsApp chat I had earlier in the year when I sent a scanned copy of the photograph to a friend. What struck me immediately, I looked at it, was the similarity to photographs I have taken during my time on the road. In most of these newer photographs, as in the old one, I am standing with my hands joined above my crotch, like a footballer defending a free kick. At first, I am surprised by this similarity, feeling I am a double of my earlier self. From this surprise comes uncanniness, and from this uncanniness, a sentiment as certain as remembrance, to quote Barthes when he writes about the winter garden photograph of his mother. I cannot think of my poses in 2014 without remembering my pose as a boy, saddened by the imminent departure of my father. Often a photograph is a trace and reference. It does not revel only in the immediate, but in the moments that came before. The human body, in the same way, carries a lived past with it. It contains a vernacular that is conveyed from the moment the body can stand until it is reposed. In other words, my body remembered the pose my mind had forgotten. A part of me had foreseen the moments would cross into Europe. It seemed this prescience manifested in the wearing of a drap was a desperate attempt to become intimate, so that when I would wear the stranger's body in Europe, I would remember I had navigated through strangeness in Mauritania. Strangers is not comfortable. There are many ways it is made manifest, in a different language, in a different skin color, in a different mode of dressing. We recognize it immediately because it is always blatant and because it looks like a border. People who embody strangeness do not think lightly of their condition. I am speaking particularly of the foreigner who has recently arrived at the place. People have constantly made claims to cities. There are many who move into urban areas intending to build something out of nothing because they are attracted by the prospect of being integrated in a community of hustlers. But one challenge for this group is that upon arrival, without family or domicile, their movement is restricted. They are known as loiterers or vagabonds. They are in certain ways the African equivalent of the European flaneur, idle and walking aimlessly while projecting on the world their understanding of its workings. Yet in some other ways they are different. One major distinction is that flânery is often conceived as the practice of an intellectual, mostly a well-off idler, and loitering the practice of a homeless, unemployed vagabond. I am not unemployed or homeless, I think I was, but I sympathize with an aimless walk. In a walk of this kind, without an end in mind, movement is tempered with resilience. An aimless walk in Mauritania resembles the walk of an immigrant across the Sahara desert. Emptied of everything but a resolve, the immigrant has poorly judged the limits of endurance. Some will survive test, others will. Some will not survive test, others will. Some will lose blood from failed abortion, and their fallen bodies will be disguised as a heap of stones. Non-immigrants will shake their heads in wonderment when these stories are told, asking, why did you put yourself through it? But movement demands no explanation, only response to an impulse. Governments think this impulse is dangerous or a threat or bad behavior, so they criminalize movement, make borders fairer, and call immigrants who move against all odds the despicable lot of the world. Very quickly, we see that what's really at stake is the commodification of movement. Governments would only accept those who can pay for their movement, tourists or businessmen or wealthy idlers. So I'll just, run through some of the images of the walk in Mauritania. An end. So this is like faking entry into a mosque. And because of the way I dressed, one of the guys who was going to pray stopped and took my hands and shook me very well and called me brother, which is kind of cool. I don't think my parents would would like that I tried to enter into a mosque, but shout out to them. Did.
Who took these photos?
Emeka Okereke. So did I mention that? And anyway, it was a collaboration with him, and we, I just took a walk, and he walked with me for hours and making this incredibly, not because I'm in it, but incredibly beautiful photographs. There were people, it was just on the street. And I think they were just really surprised at what we were doing. So it was hard. Nobody confronted us really, which was interesting also. But then I'll get to an image that for me summed up this experience. We're walking past, and this group of boys or young men in a tent said to us, "Come over, let's take a photo." And it's just more or less showed how, defined for me what an intimate stranger could be. And at that moment, all that mattered was that I became like them. I was wearing this thing that looked like what they would wear. And so I hope I can, if there are questions, I can cover some additional reflections and experiences during the Q&A, except, of course, if I've bored you the whole time. Thank you. So this is, Wolof for Life is Movement. And I'm still trying to figure out, everything that happened. But, it's first of all a very difficult trip in every sense of the word. And at some point, people realize that they can't cohabit, literally. They can't, bear this person for a few more weeks. And but I think things just kind of got out of hand, which for me is not in the least surprising. And they left just after we had finished the exhibition in Amsterdam, and they were about to go into Germany, I think, when they left. So it's something I'm still figuring out, and I hope that I can get answers when I join the rest of the team this weekend. This is, you can access everything on through this link, and it's also an app. So if you want to download it, you can, and there's a channel for each of the participating artists, and each person has kind of a blog of his own that contains everything that they posted during the road trip.
Is it what you get to from clicking on the Facebook link?
No, it's the Facebook page is also useful because that's where you update, images of events and meetings that we have while on the road. But this is more like the work that is being produced, and the writings and the images and videos as well. When we were thinking of this year's road trip, we were very conscious of an Africa that stretched beyond what's geographically known as Africa, and we're very interested in what happens. Movement has been at the core of the project, and we realized that there was a lot of movement of Africa out of what has been defined as the African continent. And so when you meet people who have Nigerians anywhere are Nigerians, and so that notion of what an Africa as a continent is began to more or less break open, and we began to realize that we could actually chart this movement across from the continent to other parts of the world, and because we didn't think that Africa is just a place, right? It also stretches into a concept and a metaphor as well. That was fundamentally, and it's all an experiment, really. And so the plan. I don't know where we are going to travel to next. I don't even I don't know what's going to happen yet. I need to have that discussion. But But one of the things that is central to our thinking on the road is, the idea of Trans-African exchange. And what that means is what kind of collaborations can happen between people from different African countries, especially through art. And so we keep thinking of new ways to push this meaning of Trans-Africanism. And what's the energy, what kind of energy exists on the continent now, and of course, in its diaspora. And one of the things I've been thinking about in the last couple of days is that the idea of a diaspora is very, it kind of comes from the word dispersal. And so just this idea of an osmotic kind of, thing that is happening when you mention the word diaspora, when you mention the word Africa, is something that is at the heart of what we are doing. So for us, it's really how do maps shift, how do the African map begins to take on. And first of all, it was constructed. It was a name that was given to us. And we are trying to escape that naming, which is impossible, I guess. Or difficult, not impossible. This project was founded by photographers. And the very nature of photography is always in conflict with the nature of writing. So part of the issues while we were on the road was that the photographers kept thinking that the writers could walk with the same speed and urgency with which they walked. And it's impossible, right? And so I think that just the attempt to that's why I devised all these cop-out strategies to write shorter, so you can revise a sentence 5 times instead of trying to revise an essay just once. So I think that for me, that's one of the things that I became conscious of, while on this trip. And also the idea that we are coming from different countries, and a Kenyan is very different from a Nigerian. That's just a starting point. A Kenyan is very different from a Nigerian. Someone from East Africa from Ethiopia or from Eritrea is very different from a Nigerian. So, one of the very popular traits of Nigerians is that we are very arrogant, and that we can be very loud, So I can always almost tell if I'm sitting with a Nigerian in a restaurant. If you want to try it, you can visit the Buka, restaurants in Brooklyn. But we are very, very different. We have different, we come with different subtleties and sensibilities, and so that I think was also another border. So when I'm saying something to you, you're understanding something quite different. You're thinking that I'm trying to be smart. Just like, what happens when you bring very diverse people together. Those are the 2 things I can think of now. Really, the root of it, so the first thing I should say is that I always think of Trans-Africanism through Soyinka saying a tiger doesn't need to defend his tigritude, right? And what that means is that we can accept that we have been called Africans, right? And then it creates a bracket, but then we can stumble within those brackets. And what attracts me to the idea of Trans-Africanism is that it emphasizes the diversity. Whereas Pan-African, I think first of all, Trans-Africanism is a kind of descendant from Pan-Africanism, and after most countries in Africa became independent in the 60s, there was this need to claim an African identity, and so you have Senghor writing what he wrote, and I think actually that's MSZ's version of Pan-African or negritude was kind of more amenable to the idea of Trans-Africanism, but that's another conversation. So I don't for me it's really a tedious. It's really tedious to try to make those distinctions always. That we are not Pan-Africanist, we are Trans-Africanist. But I think that why I prefer to use that word is just that it's more or less like a stumbling within a bracket. It's more or less like emphasizing diversity. more than anything else, more than this collectivist spirit. And I'm, Chimurenga is very close to our hearts. I mean, I don't negate, what they are trying to do or their sensibilities. I think it's still possible to have a Pan-African ideal, but that's not the way I would like to think about these things, I guess. Yeah. It was a better experience than the first, other editions for some reason. And if I want to think about criminalization of this movement, I only think about the fact that we couldn't get a Moroccan visa. I mean, the actual crossing itself, the most that you're asked is to give a bribe, right? So as a Nigerian, I don't need a visa to travel through West African countries. But when you get to the borders, they're asking for all kinds of things. So the stamp that they need to stamp on your passport, they'll say, you need to pay 500 sefa to do that. And so all of this is just really like corruption. And I remember a man saying to us that, corruption, corruption had existed before we were born, and it would keep existing after we are dead, right? So I think that for me, the most significant criminalization was really not being able to get into Morocco. And one of the very interesting things is that with a project of this kind, you begin to attract attention because it's something that is very adventurous. And what we've been always trying to do is to go beyond that and say we are pushing beyond this idea of an adventure. We are trying to do something else. We are working with images. We are working with text. But it did get us a lot of attention. And the Prince Claus is one of the major art funders in the Global South, and we've been working with them for years now. And they just held, an exhibition, as I said. So we've also had reports on CNN of all places. So it's really just getting bigger. Yeah, we worked with Everyday Africa up till the time we got into Europe, and Everyday Africa is this Instagram account. Is the account it's called Instagram feed or something that kind of posts. It's kind of a group thing, allows photographers working in different parts of the continent to upload images of everyday life and, to kind of move away from the stereotypes and get into the banal and just show images of people living out their lives. And so for this edition, and they have almost 200,000 followers. And so for this edition, we partnered with them to, put up images every day, from the road. So to go to your question, I think it differed really because some of these photographers were coming as photojournalists, and what that meant was that you had to always shoot. And some were coming as more conceptual like Emeka is a more conceptual and, thinking about performance as well. And some of these other photographers are visual artists. So it kind of varied, but the thing, of course, is that we are producing more images than we could look at, literally. And so, regardless, and if you have up to 4 photographers or who work with, photography, that you're going to be having a lot of images on a daily basis. So I guess, I don't know if I answered your question, but I guess, of course, we were oversaturated with images. And as I said, part of my thinking, of course, coming from this program and studying under Levi is to think about how we can slow these things down and how through the writing about these images or looking at the experiences we're having, we could begin to more or less figure out how they are working and not just, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.